So when people ask about the white ethnostate, what's the plan for it? What's the idea? On the one hand, I don't feel like giving so many specifics would be too meaningful at this point. But at the same time, if I don't give a basic idea of it, then their imaginations will come in and fill the void. Or worse yet, someone else could come along with really bad ideas about how to do this, and their really bad ideas would come to dominate the discussion. So first off, what is the point about this? Well, the point is for a country that acts as an anchor for Europeans around the world. If something goes bad in France, if whites become a minority in France, where can they go? Another question, why aren't the whites in South Africa already given refugee status by every majority white country on the planet? That's something New Europe would do. Maybe Eastern European countries will let them in, maybe not, maybe they'll let some in, who knows? The point is to have a country that looks out specifically for the interests of white people in a way that the United States today simply does not. It would actually be rather similar to how Israel functions as a place that all Jews can go to if things get bad where they are. And I personally think every race or every religion, every identifiable group of people should have some carve out on the planet that they can go to, that can be a place for their people, their homeland. There are two basic ways the white ethnostate could form that I see. One is that a country in Eastern Europe decides to take up this role. The other is that we carve this country out of the United States, and I'm going to talk about that here. Such an idea is going to seem insane on first glance to the average person. But there's some data that I think shows that this is not as completely ludicrous as one might think upon an immediate first impression. Today, there are probably around 77.22 million people that want their state to secede from the Union today. In 2014, Ipsos Reuters did a poll and found that 23.9% of the people they surveyed wanted their state to secede. If that number is extrapolated onto the population today, that would be about 77 million separatists in the US. To put it another way, there are about 15 million more separatists than there were Trump voters. Of course, 53.3% of those polled opposed their state leaving the Union. But we can compare this to Trump's numbers in February of 2016 when his approval rating was at its lowest. Trump had a 33% approval rating to 60% disapproval, which was a 27-point gap. Compare this to the support of your state seceding having a 29.4-point gap between approve of it and disapprove of it. In particular regions and times, this number is higher. In California, it was 32% in January of 2017, and in the Southwest in 2014, it was 34% supporting their state leaving the Union. In addition, 40% of Texans supported their state seceding if Hillary won during the Trump-Clinton campaign. The general support for secession is not as low as you might think, and it is very malleable, and it only needs to break 50% in a few places for it to become actionable. It doesn't necessarily need to break 50% across the whole United States, for example, for Texas or California to secede. Now, based on polling on Charlottesville, we can infer that there are about 12.9 million people willing to tell a pollster that they strongly support the alt-right in August of 2017. About 4% of those polled said that they strongly support the alt-right. There's about 323 million people in the US. That works out to about 12.92 million. These states here, colored in green, have a combined population of slightly less than 5 million. If we had enough agency and coordination, we could take it. You don't have to join some commune, just move to those states. Besides, they're nice states. To start, more people support letting a state secede than they do using the military to keep states in the Union. According to a 2017 Zogby poll, 39% support allowing secession if a state wants it, 32% support sending in the army. In addition, the age group 18 to 29 has 47% support for allowing a state to secede. This is not saying that they want their state to secede, just that they endorse a state's right to secede. But even if the public was opposed to military action against a seceding state, the federal government could still intervene. Fair enough. But I will point out that the US has allowed one territory to secede, the Philippines. Granted, the Philippines wasn't a state and it wasn't on the continent, but it's not nothing. Now, the immediate go-to argument against the practicality of secession is that the federal government will move to quash secession just like it did in 1861 against the Confederate States of America. But it's important to point out that technically the US invaded invaded the Confederate States because South Carolina fired on Fort Sumter, not because it seceded. The Union did not invade the Confederate States for around 6 months as states started to break off from the Union. I think it's clear that Lincoln was going to find some excuse sooner or later to invade the Confederate States because that's what he wanted to do. But it's important to point out that technically the invasion of the Confederate States was not a referendum on the right of secession. That aside, just because the US quashed secession in 1861, that means they'll do it again in 2024. Let's look at the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union also fought wars to prevent states from seceding during their own much bloodier civil war. They prevented all of the Central Asian republics, the Stand Land, from seceding, and they invaded Ukraine to prevent them from seceding. They also attempted to invade Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania from 1918 to 1920. All of these countries became part of the Soviet Union, but were eventually released without firing a shot. And what makes this more extreme is that the Soviet Union was fighting its own war within Russia and Siberia in the 1920s against social democrats, monarchists, and expeditionary forces from Western Europe, Japan, the German Free Corps, and even Czechoslovakia. And despite all of this, the Soviets were willing to divert resources to invade the Baltic states, Ukraine, and Central Asia. So the Bolsheviks were fanatical about trying to hold on to these states. Yet in 1991, the Soviet Union wasn't in the best economic shape, but it was certainly better off than it was in the 1920s when the whole country was literally on fire. And yet in 1991, the Soviet Union just let these countries go. They certainly had the resources to keep these countries in the Soviet Union. If it had the resources to do it in the 1920s, it certainly did in 1991, but they just let these countries go, after previously just going to the mat to try to keep hold of these areas. This also happened in the Warsaw Pact countries. The Soviet Union sent in troops to crush rebellions in Czechia, in Hungary, in Slovakia, in Poland, and East Germany. But then in 1991, despite previously having used military force to prevent exit, they just let them go. The British Empire has several examples of having fought wars to prevent secession, but then just letting those countries go. In India, the British fought several wars to prevent parts of India from breaking off, but then in 1948, they just let the whole thing go. Ireland is another example of this. Britain fought several wars to conquer Ireland and then put down several rebellions, but then eventually just let Ireland go. Canada is kind of interesting. While Canada never fought a war with Britain, Britain did fight a war with the United States in an attempt to prevent the US from seceding, but then Canada, which is right next to the US if you didn't notice, was just allowed to secede. And I think this is analogous enough to show that just because an empire goes to war to stop secession at one point doesn't necessarily mean they'll do it forever, or even that they'll do it the next time. Ideally, the United States would be partitioned at the county level, and I've mapped out the US at the county level here, mapping out majority black areas, majority Hispanic areas, majority non-white areas, slight majority white areas, and heavy majority white areas, and shitlib areas in red, areas that are majority white but still voted for Hillary over Trump. And the countries to be formed for my ideal partition, if I were king and I could dictate this, would look something like this. I would have some discontinuities, but I don't think that really matters that much. The US has had a discontinuity with Alaska for all of its existence, and Russia has a discontinuity with Kalinin, and most people don't even know that. It's literally no issue at all. And the names of these countries, you can name them whatever you want. And you could put little flags or whatever, and these are just the areas that I would have for the new countries. For this setup, yes, some people would have to move. Others would be heavily compelled to move. For example, if you were white and lived in this orange country here, or were black and wanted to live in the black ethnostate, but you didn't live in the prescribed area at first, you may have to move to go to the country that you want to go to, or you may really be compelled to do so. Now, to deal with the issue of moving, let's take a more humble plan. The small white ethnostate. Landlocked, but hopeful to carve a path through counties in southern Oregon to get to the Pacific. But at the start, it's just bog standard state-level secession, not breaking along county lines, because technically it's states that are sovereign, not counties. All of these states up here in green are over 80% white right now, and the goal would be to get to around 90% white. Now, about 12% of the US population moves each year according to the US Census Bureau. Now, if that seems like a lot, well, for a single person, that's only one move every 8 years and 4 months. In addition, I would predict a large influx of of white people moving into these states, and we would have a planning set up for immigrants to get people with the right businesses and professions and the right proportions to start up new towns, so you don't get weird labor imbalances. By simply preventing non-whites from moving into New Europe, it's possible that enough non-Europeans will just leave on their own accord, and they're not being replaced by new non-whites, so that would be one factor to the whitening of the area. We can also carve out a Lakota territory as well, pulling the Amerindians out of New Europe into their own country. And by all of these factors, there's a chance that New Europe could reach 90% white without having to do a whole lot of anything at all. But let's say all these things, the influx of white people, the leaving of non-whites and their lack of replacement by new non-whites, the Lakota or other Native American tribes being pulled into their own territorial set-aside. Let's say all of that is not enough. Well, then New York could just start paying non-whites to leave. And that's really it. I have no hard-on for authoritarianism, especially when it's not needed. Now, there are an infinite number of ways this could go down. One shouldn't fixate on a single strategy. Ideally, there'd be a pan-separatist movement that sweeps the United States, and there is an organized top-down partition similar to what happened in India, though with less economic hardship given how the US population is orders of magnitude more mobile than the population of India was back then, even than the population of India is today. Now, if you love America, that's fine. I'm fine with you, if you want, having a government in a carve-out of the United States that perfectly mimics the current government structure of the United States today. You can have a territorial set-aside, maybe call it the United States Continuation Government, that perfectly mimics the United States today. The Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Congress, Supreme Court, all of that. And that's fine. I'm not against people who want to do that. I just think that we can do better.